So I want to begin by thanking you for joining us for this evening's lecture and conversation with Stephen Nelson. This is the keynote presentation for the 2020 Edgar P. Richardson Lecture Series. I'm Gwendolyn Du Bois-Shaw. I'm the senior historian here at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, and I'm also the acting chief curator at present. And I am the director of Portal, the National Portrait Gallery Scholarly Center, which is the organizer for today's event. We have live closed captioning available for you, and that can be accessed along the bottom menu, as can the question and answer function, into which you are welcome to submit questions to be answered during the second half of tonight's event. And I want to assure you that if you want to share this program or any of our other Portal programs from the last few months, they are available on our YouTube channel, and we encourage you to subscribe so you won't miss any future events. In the material world, the National Portrait Gallery is now open to the public once again. If you would like to visit us in person, we encourage you to start by going to the Portrait Gallery's website, where you may reserve free timed entry passes. We are open Wednesdays through Sundays, 11:30 a.m. to 7 p.m. Although we gather digitally this evening, we gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities that make their home wherever you are today. At the National Portrait Gallery, we believe that portraiture is powerful, but we also fully acknowledge that not all people have had equal access to the dominant modes of portraiture, especially painting and sculpture. Nor did everybody always have control over the ways that they were represented. This was especially the case for actively marginalized people of color, Native and Indigenous people, enslaved people, working class people. So it is our commitment to overcome this history of inequality. And you can witness that in our efforts to diversify our collections by collecting at least 50% portraits of people of color each year. And also the diverse exhibition schedule that we maintain. This includes our current special exhibition, Her Story, A Century of Women Writers, which features portraits of 24 influential authors, including Margaret Wise Brown, Toni Morrison, Anne Sexton, Susan Sontag, Alice Walker, and others. Her Story was supported by the Smithsonian's American Women's History Initiative. This Friday, November 13th, we are very pleased to open another major exhibition devoted to women's history, Every Eye is Upon Me, First Ladies of the United States, which runs through May of 2021. This is the first major exhibition to explore the historical significance of this prominent position through the mode of portraiture. It was organized by yours truly as the curator in collaboration with the White House, the National First Ladies Library, and it spans nearly 250 years from Martha Washington to Melania Trump. It features over 60 portraits of First Ladies, and it includes this fantastic companion book, which is now available through the Portrait Gallery's website. You can purchase it there. And there are all kinds of special things in the exhibition that I think you'll enjoy, including a special video presentation by photographer Annie Leibovitz. So for tonight, named in honor of Edgar P. Richardson, this lecture series pays tribute to Mr. Richardson's significant contributions to the field of American art. He served as both the Detroit Institute of Arts and the H.F. DuPont Winterthur Museum directors, and he was the co-founder of the Archives of American Art and a commissioner of the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery from 1965 until 1979. The Edgar P. Richardson Symposium was established at the National Portrait Gallery with the generous support of Mr. Richardson's longtime friend, Mr. Robert L. McNeil Jr., and we're grateful to his philanthropic legacy through the Barr Foundation, whose current custodians have allowed us to temporarily convert the symposium into an online lecture series. This is the second Richardson that I have had the honor of organizing. The other was a two-day symposium in 2016 on racial masquerade in American art and culture. And it seems appropriate that the former was held just a week before the 2016 general election, and that this one is wrapping up the week after the 2020 general election here in the United States. I remember the anticipation and trepidation that was in the air 4 years ago as we convened to discuss the pernicious nature of racial stereotypes of African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, and the challenges that such images made to popular visual representation in contemporary art. Not knowing how prescient that discussion would be for the challenges that we as a nation would face in the immediate future in the intervening 4 years. And now, over the past few weeks, our 2020 Richardson lecturers have focused on women as artists, women as subjects, the relationships that these women had to power, and the ways that they made spaces for themselves visually and communicated through art. We have heard remarkable lectures on Miki Hayakawa, Queen Margaret of Spain, Lois Mailou Jones, Suzanne Valadon, and Maria Izquierdo. And tonight we will hear about a remarkable group of portraits of African American women that came to the National Portrait Gallery in the late 1960s through a major gift of the Harmon Foundation. The topics taken up by the Richardson, this topic, I believe is also unusually prescient because this past week, 74 million voters in this country chose to elect a presidential ticket that includes someone who is not only the first woman, but the first African American, the first Indian American to the vice presidency of the United States. And if my Instagram and Facebook feeds are any indication, Kamala Harris is well on her way to being an enormously popular subject in American portraiture. And now to today's speaker. Stephen Nelson is the Dean of the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts. I just want to say that again, because this is another first and a truly monumental and wonderful thing. Stephen Nelson is the Dean of the Center for the Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, where he is responsible for its fellowships, meetings, research, and publications. In addition to his award-winning book, From Cameroon to Paris, Moscow Architecture in and Out of Africa from University of Chicago Press, Nelson has published widely on the arts, architecture, and urbanism of Africa and its diasporas, as well as on queer studies. Nelson is Professor Emeritus from the University of California, Los Angeles, where he served as director of the African Studies Center and advised on the university's diversity and inclusion strategic planning. Before assuming the role of dean, he was CASVA's Andrew W. Mellon Professor. Nelson earned a BA in studio art from Yale University and an AM and a PhD in art history from Harvard University. And he is amazing and wonderful, and I am so eager to hear his lecture tonight. So please join me virtually with a big round of applause for Stephen Nelson.
Here we are. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. I wish it were in person. I want to thank Gwendolyn Du Bois Shaw, who I'm just going to call Gwendolyn because she's like a friend, for organizing this and for her lovely introduction. I would also like to thank Jacqueline Petito over at the National Portrait Gallery in Portal for all of the work she did in putting all of these amazing lectures together. I would also like to thank my colleague Elise Ferrone over at the National Gallery of Art for her help in collating materials for me that went into this talk. So without further ado, let's get started. On May 2nd, 1944, portraits of, oh, I need to share my screen, don't I? Let's do this. Continue. All right. There we go. We good? Not hearing anything, I'm assuming yes. So
Fabulous.
Fabulous. Okay, great. On May 2nd, 1944, the exhibition Portraits of Outstanding Americans of Negro Origin opened at the Smithsonian Institution's National Collection of Fine Arts. The opening's highlight was the donation of artist Betty Graves Reyneau's portrait of renowned scientist George Washington Carver to the institution. The New York Times reported that Vice President Henry Wallace made the presentation to a group of onlookers that included luminaries, among which was Eleanor Roosevelt. The reporter also suggested that Reyneau's portrait shows the scientist gazing at the amaryllis as if to solve its secrets. 22 other portraits by Reyneau and African-American artist Laura Wheeler Waring joined the Carver portrait. The exhibition, formed through a collaboration between Reyneau, a white artist, and Mary Beatty Brady, longtime director of the Harmon Foundation, intended to use painting to undo racism and unhinged stereotypes of African Americans prevalent at the time. The Smithsonian was only the exhibition's first stop. Perhaps the most amazing feature of Portraits of Outstanding Americans is its 10-year tour that took the portraits either as original paintings or photographic reproductions to museums and libraries all over the United States. During the tour, Reyneau continued to add portraits to the collection. By 1954, the exhibition would have nearly 50 portraits on offer. In a sense, this exhibition is an extraordinary case of art as didacticism. The works therein were treated as agents of change. In a 1950 interview, Reyneau herself suggested as much, referring to the enterprise as, quote, a visual education project. She hoped that many persons can be made to realize the outstanding contributions Negroes have made to the life of the nation. When I first encountered this exhibition, I thought it would be a route to examine the work of Laura Wheeler Waring, a well-known African-American artist whose practice had received far less attention than warranted. Yet as I continued to look through material, and as I realized she contributed only 6 portraits to the exhibition, and I should note that she died in 1948, so midway through the tour, I began to think about the kind of ideological lifting the exhibition had been doing during its tour, which is bracketed by the Second World War and the landmark 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education Supreme Court decision. This exhibition had little to do with the greatness of American portraiture, but it had everything to do with the portrait's ability to be more than itself. Portraits of Outstanding Americans of Negro origin fits into overlapping categories. The first is the relationship of portraits to the representation of America. The second is the relationship of portraits to Black racial uplift. While the exhibition was organized by Reyneau and Brady, in collaborating with NAACP chapters across the country, we can understand the exhibition as part of the longue array of visual imagery aimed at bolstering the image of African Americans for both ourselves and for others. With this in mind, today's presentation is a preliminary discussion of portraits of outstanding Americans of Negro origin within the framework of intersecting discourses of race and racism, gender, Black representation, and the defining of Americanness in the first half of the 20th century. Reyneau, who had been an active suffragist, had lived and worked in Europe from 1927 to 1939. Upon her return to the States, she was horrified at the lack of full rights for African Americans, comparing their treatment in this country to German fascism. Her biographers, Catherine Adams and Michael Keene, suggest that, like her engagement with working for the rights of women to vote, she wanted to participate in the struggle for racial equality. She figured that she could do her part through representation, through creating sympathetic portraits of African Americans that would increase respect for African Americans to whites and who too often assumed less than full humanity of their Black brethren. Reyneau began in Florida. Here in 1942, I'm gonna jump a little bit. In 1942, she created a portrait of Edward Lee, a young garden worker. Adams and Keene note that this work fueled her desire to celebrate the unheralded and the overlooked. Searching for other Black subjects and with an eye towards topics that would resonate with American national sentiment during the war, she decided to embark on portraits of participants in the flight program at the Tuskegee Army Airfield. However, when she arrived in April 1942, there were no classes in session. While she was at the Tuskegee Institute, she met George Washington Carver and convinced him to sit for her, hence our portrait. It is fair to say that this encounter between Reyneau and Carver, was the beginning of Portraits of Outstanding Americans. Carver passed away 3 months after Reyneau completed her portrait, and by 1943, Congress had authorized the Department of the Interior to purchase Carver's childhood home and to transform it into a national monument. The institution used Reyneau's portrait to illustrate the pamphlet it produced to seek funding for the project. At the same time, the Smithsonian agreed to take the painting into its collection. Reyneau's portrait would be the first of an African American to enter a national collection. In discussions with the Smithsonian, Reyneau articulated her desire to bring attention to Black achievement through portraiture. Upon hearing this, the Smithsonian exhibitors put her in touch with the Harmon Foundation. Soon, Reyneau met Mary Beatty Brady, who had been the foundation's director since 1928. In fact, she was the foundation's only director in its whole time. The two women shared a common goal: to advance racial equality. While the foundation supported varied programs in support of African Americans and in improving race relations, it is best known for its support of African American art and artists. By the time the foundation closed its doors in 1967, it had amassed a large collection of African American art, the majority of which is now in Smithsonian Institution collections. Bound together in a desire to use art to improve race relations, Reyneau and Brady organized portraits of outstanding Americans. They understood that the work that this exhibition might be able to do in changing white attitudes about African Americans. This said, it is also important to bring in, they knew that it was also important to bring in African Americans to help shape their venture. The two women brought in Laura Willie Waring to help. Waring was well known in African American art circles and had enjoyed Harmon support since the 1920s. The artist received the foundation's 1927 gold medal for distinguished achievement among Negroes. In addition to commissioning her work, Reyneau and Brady figured that Wheeler could help them make connections with prominent African Americans, and she did. They also knew that her presence would grant the project gravitas that would be unachievable in the hands of two white women. One of the most persistent strains of Black representation through the 20th century has been showing Black achievement through the representation of outstanding members of the race. W.E.B. Du Bois famously showed the lives and achievements of African Americans at the 1900 Universal Exhibition in Paris. Bringing together 363 images of Black Americans into albums titled Types of American Negroes, Georgia, USA, and Negro Life in Georgia, USA. Visitors encountered myriad pictures of affluent African Americans that flew in the face of prevailing notions of Black inferiority. Du Bois himself said that here, visitors would see, quote, several volumes of photographs of typical Negro faces, which hardly square with conventional American ideas. I'm losing my pages. That same year, Booker T. Washington published A New Negro for a New Century, an accurate and up-to-date record of the upward struggles of the Negro race. This 428-page book contains 60 photographic portraits of white-collar African-American men and women. It also includes Black histories, slave narratives, biographical sketches, journalism, and highlights of Black participation in military campaigns from the American Revolution to the Spanish-American War, which was still fresh in the minds of the American body politic. Among those included in this illustrious group are Washington himself, Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, educator and women's rights activist Fanny Barber Williams, and poet, novelist, and playwright Paul Laurence Dunbar. The book's authors stressed, this book has been rightly named A New Negro for a New Century. The Negro of today is in every phase of life far advanced over the Negro of 30 years ago. In the following pages, the progressive life of Afro-American people has been written in the light of achievements that will be surprising to people who are ignorant of the enlarging life of these remarkable people. The advancement of Black people from slavery to the turn of the 20th century happened at breakneck speed. Figures such as Du Bois and Washington were convinced that photographs were essential to the communication of this feat. With their fidelity to the truth of photography, such images stood as irrefutable evidence of Black achievement and Black progress. They hoped that such representations would not only disabuse white racism, but also bolster Black self-esteem. In a similar vein, Elaine Locke, in 1925, published a special edition of the magazine Survey Graphic that heralded Harlem as the Mecca of the New Negro. In its pages, Locke laid out a map of African-American achievement and modern life that was a compendium of cultural activity, as well as a prescription for moving forward. In the economic, political, and cultural realms, all of these men invoked the visual, whether in paint, photography, or popular culture, as weapons in the war on American racism. As Henry Louis Gates Jr. has insisted, Locke's New Negro, as a poet, a person of letters who would disabuse white racism not through political action, but through participation in the arts and letters, was only the newest in a long series of New Negroes. On the most basic level, showing that there are Black Shakespeares and Black Michelangelos would lead Euro-Americans to, in Gates's words, finally embrace the Negro. In Gates's reading, this new Negro, apart from the color of their skin, was just like every other American. And in their ability to move ahead, to achieve, they were as deserving as anybody else for the fruits of full citizenship in the United States. While Locke's New Negro may not have been the political activist, the military hero, or the shrewd businessman of his predecessors, it was nonetheless at this moment that the Harmon Foundation, founded in 1922, and Brady came into contact with African-American arts and letters. The foundation in 1926 created awards for distinguished achievement in 8 different fields, including literature, fine arts, business and industry, science and innovation, education, religion, and race relations. The first recipients for the Achievement in the Fine Arts Award were Palmer Hayden and Hale Woodruff. From 1928 to 1935, the foundation sponsored several exhibitions of African-American art that toured the United States. Brady invited Locke to write the catalog essay for the foundation's 1931 exhibition, which, as Jeffrey Stewart points out, was her way to get his help in curating that year's exhibition. He did both. Excuse me for 1 second. The relationship between Locke and Brady proved mutually beneficial. This platform allowed Locke to frame Black art and Black cultural history, which he did with aplomb. He was also able to persuade larger audiences to understand Black cultural production as art with a capital A. While Locke would not become the Harmon Foundation's permanent curator, Brady called upon him to help organize outstanding Americans. In essence, with Locke, who by the 1940s had become one of the driving forces of African-American art, and Wheeler, a well-respected and well-connected African-American artist in the mix, Reyneau and Brady could credibly claim that the exhibition was a prime example of not only the representation of Black achievement, but also of interracial cooperation. Throughout the exhibition's tour, the two women would partner with Black organizations in the locales where the work appeared. In addition to portraits of outstanding Americans of Negro origins, attachment to and continuation of the depiction of Black achievement for both African-American and white audiences. The exhibition was planned and appeared on the heels of the Great Depression and during the Second World War, at a moment when it seemed that the very question of Americanness was up for debate. From the Foreign Security Administration, or the FSA, photos of the 1930s, typified by Walker Evans, Dorothea Lange, and others, as well as the Index of American Design, the Federal Arts 18,000 image record of American decorative and popular arts. The United States grappled with how to visualize, indeed how to define a distinctive American national identity. Art historian Erica Doss notes a burgeoning cultural nationalism with respect to American art and visual culture in the interwar years. FSA photos and the documentation of design participated in this consolidation of an American culture not only distinct from, but also superior to Europe. The photographs depicted urban and rural poverty, registering as depictions of primordial, pre-modern United States. Stuart Kidd suggests that the exoticization of these subjects, particularly those in the South, which is not where this particular photo was shot, served as cultural symbols, highlighting, in the author's words, New Deal liberal politics registered in efforts to democratize American politics and culture. The Washington Post describes such pictures as, quote, 100% quaint as well as 100% American. While it may seem bizarre to bring in the index of American design, the Americanness, the quaint symbols of a long-standing culture transferred onto images of abject poverty were also transferred onto American design and popular culture. In this context, like the photographs, these drawings, which define the United States as a place with a usable past, and that's Doss's term, and I think it's term, and it's really, really useful and important, aided in the construction of a cultural nationalism for the American public. Looking from the vantage point of the 21st century, the relative absence of African-American materials in the Index of American Art is striking. However, we don't know how many African-American artists were actually involved in the making of these things. Such lacunae for Doss, however, reveals the tensions and the limitations that surround the production of cultural nationalism in New Deal America. Portraits of Outstanding Americans of Negro Origin lives in and through these tensions and limitations of the visualization of Americanness. Perhaps more to the point, one of the primary challenges the exhibition's organizers faced was how to transcend the vexed relationship between Americanness and race. What do we make of a 1940s exhibition that depicts an affluent group of Black subjects at their very best? How might Waring's portrait of Marian Anderson in performance, or of W.E.B. Du Bois with his spectacles, align with a kind of cultural nationalism steeped in continuity with the past? How does Reyneau's heroic portrait of Tuskegee Airman William Ayres Campbell by the side of his plane, or of Dr. Anna Arnold Hedgeman, trouble the contours of the production of Americanness? In short, how did the show, if it did at all, short-circuit an image of Americanness that, whether rich or poor, whether modern or not, is white? Although such tensions might have been lost on Reyneau and Brady, despite their desire for improved race relations and racial equity, I suspect they were not lost on Locke, who, by the way, appears in the exhibition, who was very attuned to the relationship between the representation of African Americans and the larger terrain of Americanness. As Stewart points out, Locke and others also knew that African American art, despite tensions around race and the representation of the national body politic, was important as, quote, a symbol for Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal of Black incorporation into a discourse of American nationalism. Would the same be true for portraits of affluent, well-known African Americans? While picturing the further progress of a race, would they also be seen, as the exhibition's title suggested, as being just like other affluent Americans? In 1942, in the midst of a raging world war, Paul Kellogg, editor-in-chief of Survey Graphic, asked Locke to guest edit a special issue focusing on race, African Americans, and the American war effort that might align with the 4 freedoms President Roosevelt laid out in his January 1941 State of the Union address. These included freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Many Black Americans, including Locke, insisted that such freedoms were out of reach for them at home. The Chicago Defender insisted that freedom abroad would not happen without freedom at home. Locke himself insisted that without racial equality, there would be no peace. Locke accepted the assignment. In his introduction titled Color, The Unfinished Business of Democracy, he articulated a vision of democracy that was inclusive, global, anti-imperial, and, to put it in 21st century speak, decolonial. This said, like his New Negro of the 1920s, Locke did not imagine a world that was equitable. He saw the war and Black participation in it as an opportunity for a new mental geography of Americanness. New forces for unification, Locke writes, are closing in on that great divide of color, which for so long and so tragically has separated not only East and West, but 2/3 of mankind from the other third. While diasporic, even global in its outlook, Locke's passage had everything to do with the American black and white divide, a chasm that existed not only at home, but most everywhere. Although Locke sketched out a global setting for the place of Black peoples worldwide and as being requisite for a continued existence of democracy, his ideas of unification, equality, and the ironing out of difference dovetailed beautifully with Reyneau and Brady's desire to highlight Black achievement as a route towards American racial healing and African-American equality. More to the point, it dovetailed beautifully with the scripting of African-American achievement as American achievement. Whatever role Locke may have had in counseling Reyneau and Brady on the show, the fact is that this group of portraits, which Reyneau continually expanded during the exhibition's tour, was the representation of African Americans that was organized, guided, and executed by women. While Waring's role is still a bit unclear, it's safe to say that she guided Reyneau and Brady to people who would take them seriously and positively respond to their requests. On tour, Brady and Reyneau hired Bella Taylor Cooper McKnight, once called a crusader for the Negro race, to make contact with communities and to book engagements for the tour. Reyneau credited McKnight with the ability to make connections with museums, libraries, and Black communities that she could not do herself. McKnight herself recalled the position as one of the toughest, but perhaps the most satisfying she had in her long career. So there's this world of women. There's this exhibition that includes lots of men and women that gets expanded, that ebbs and flows and travels for 10 years. The question is, did people get it? Did people get this world? The white press at the time understood that these pictures were unique, even important. While they may have disabused some of their notions of Black inferiority, the pictures brought to mind the fiction of the United States as a land of opportunity, no matter what color of your skin. Kimmis Hendrick, a reporter for the Christian Science Monitor, invoked George Washington Carver's own words. Opportunity is never a matter of complexion. It is always a question of what you've got to give. The reporter lists several portraits: Mary Church Terrell, Richmond Barthé, Dr. Charles Drew of Harvard, and notes, these are not pictures of people conscious of race disadvantage, insisting instead that they are pictures of American whose talents and characters pushed them past handicaps to unusual attainment. So in other words, these are people who were able to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. This said, writers understood that the exhibition was deployed to combat racism. Moreover, the show was intensely popular. Wherever it traveled, it was met by standing room only crowds. The notion that the exhibition was a call for equality, though, was lost on many reporters and, I suspect, viewers. This said, the representational strategies engaged come out of early 20th century practices. And I think it's fair to note that these practices continue to this day. The Black press saw things a little differently. The Pittsburgh Courier noted that directors of museums which have shown the paintings advance the opinion that in some communities, a noticeable lessening of racial tensions took place following the art display. And so even there, we're not seeing people talk about the show as a driver of equality, but they do see it as affecting people's attitudes. I've argued elsewhere that often in portraits of African Americans, we see a depiction not only of individuals, but also of the race as a whole. The pictures of themselves, they are more than themselves. This was certainly the intent in the racial uplift books and images of the early 20th century. Indeed, from Frederick Douglass's views on photography to the Obama portraits, the image has been seen as capable of representing ourselves and something more than ourselves. Portraits of Outstanding Americans of Negro Origin, an exhibition that demonstrated not only the importance of the image in combating racism, but also a world organized and created by women, fits into this trajectory. Given the topic of this year's Richardson lectures, women, power, and portraiture, this exhibition, one that created an African-American compendium defined by women, is a fitting place to bring our topics home. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. I've been looking at the questions as they came through, and I have a few that I want to start out with. That
Okay.
and I'm going to push you on some of the images, but
Yeah.
first, I wanted you to say just maybe a little bit more, just to
Mhm.
kind of recap the Harmon Foundation, which may be
Oh,
new
sure.
to some listeners,
Sure, absolutely.
because it was, it was such a complicated and ambitious
So
and wide-reaching
Mhm.
project that was
Yeah.
undertaken by William E. Harmon, who was a real estate magnate,
Yes.
a white,
Yes.
very
Yes.
committed religious man who,
Yes.
believed that if you gave people
Mhm.
opportunities
Mhm.
and recognition,
Right.
equality was achievable. And I
Right.
think the thing we most often remember now as art historians
Right.
and historians is the art wing of it, but that
Mhm.
was just a part of it. So if you could say a little bit more of
Yeah,
that.
it was the art wings, which is the thing they're best known for, was a really small part. So they did work in 8 different areas. And so when I sort of blew through the awards, they were in business, they were in science, they would make playgrounds, they had nursing programs, they had a lot of programs aimed at bettering the lives of Black Americans and to advance improved race relations. And they lasted from 1920, they reformed in 1922 and they closed down in 67. And so, but these things advanced throughout. And there's, in terms of its relationship to art, Black art and Black artists, it's complicated. And so on the one hand, the Harmon Foundation from the 20s into at least the early 1960s was one of the most prominent venues that featured African-American art. And I mean, even if you see all of the material that went to the Smithsonian in 67, you get some sense of that. And it was not only African-American, it was also diasporic. And so they championed some of the earliest exhibitions in the States on African art, contemporary African art, modern African art. And so, but on the one hand, while they saw, people saw them as helping and as giving a venue, others saw them as patronizing. And so they famously said in 1940 that Black people should consider their art to be avocational, that they shouldn't strive to be professionals. And so you have all of those things, and people take that up and they argue with it. They're professionals and they're taking the money and doing whatever. And also they funded, quite a few artists traveling to Europe. And you can see correspondence where artists are sort of trying to figure out how to negotiate Brady and their stays abroad. And many of them were just completely broke when they were there. But the Harmon Foundation did lots and lots of different things.
Yeah. And Mary Beatty Brady really, was that driving force. As you said, she was the director the entire time.
The entire time. And so, I mean, and that's really interesting. And so if we bring this back to the topic of these lectures, it is fair to say that philanthropically, Brady was one of the most powerful philanthropists, someone running a foundation in the United States. I mean, in terms of what she was able to do and in terms of what she did, and for the amount of time she was able to do it. And she really called the shots. And I think what would be really interesting, and I think this pertains to this project, and I just haven't had a chance to get to the archives because COVID, that, it would be really interesting to see that correspondence between Brady and Reyneau and Locke. She and Locke had what I would describe as a reasonably complex relationship. I think they were frenemies.
Mhm. Yeah, that
Yeah.
you know, thinking about what she did, like with William H. Johnson, you know,
Yeah.
saving all of, you know, his work
Mhm.
from, you know, from destruction,
Yeah.
and you know, which is now in you know, at our sister museum at the Smithsonian American
Right.
Art
Right.
Museum, you know, amazing collection of his work. But she really did. She had, you know, all of this control, and to think about
Mhm.
these two painters, you know, working with her on this
Right.
project,
Right.
Laura Wheeler Waring, who and you know, and Betsy Graves Reyneau, and as you were going through
Mm.
the images, I
Yeah.
began to notice a difference in the ways that gender was approached.
Mhm. Mhm.
So with the male,
Yes.
there's some
Yes.
attribute, right?
Yes.
There's something
Mhm.
that signals what their
Mhm.
profession, what their achievement is. But the women,
Mhm.
not so
Not
much.
so much. Not so much.
They're like sitting in a chair, very
Sit in a
demure.
chair.
You know, see
You
my
know, they
nice
might be
striped
with it. Yeah.
dress, right?
Some might be with a globe. There was one woman who had been in the military, but they, you know, the attributes, and this is really talking about Reyneau more than Waring. Because Waring only did 6 of the portraits,
Yeah.
and some of them that were included may in fact have been done earlier. And so it's really hard to get a handle on what was expressly made for this show, at least where Waring's concerned, and then what was later brought in part because she dies during the tour, which I think explains her not having done as much as she did, or more than she had done. But also, the fact that, we think of exhibitions as these sort of things that once they appear, they're sort of in stone, but this one wasn't. And you can understand this. I mean,
Hmm.
Dr. 30 Americans. It's this thing just kept changing and it kept
Yeah.
growing. And even their styles, you could, looking at the work long enough, you can tell a Reyneau from a Waring.
Well, and with those,
Yeah.
with these portraits
Hmm.
that Reyneau did, where these women are
Yeah.
sitting there mostly. I mean, with the exception of Marian Anderson, who gets to sing and open her mouth,
Yes.
and
Yes.
wear that fur coat.
Hmm.
Um, uh, how do you think maybe that connected to ideas about Black women and lady, like woman
Mm.
versus lady, and the gender roles that Black women
Mhm.
entering
Mhm.
the middle class were being encouraged to
Mhm.
engage?
I think they're almost Victorian.
Yeah.
And and I'm thinking about the representation of women in some of those earlier compendiums. And so in Booker T. Washington's 1900 book, New New or New Century, the women in there are very well defined. They're Victorian ladies who are posed in just the right way. Nobody's really there with an attribute except for someone in a military uniform here and there, right?
Mhm.
But if you follow that trajectory, the one thing I left out were other books, Negro Progress, these kinds of things from the first decade of the
Yeah.
20th century, where they start depicting affluent women. And there's one, and I'm forgetting the book, but it was this woman, it's a full figure. It's a drawing of a woman by John Henry Adams. It was made around 1904. And they had descriptions of the people with these pictures. And so this one, I think her name, these subjects' name was Flossie.
Mhm.
And they said, well, Flossie is just sort of this wonderful lady, and she has a taste for the finer things in life and music and the violin. And that, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but only a little bit.
Yeah.
And so Black femininity gets sort of molded into white Victorian mores and morals. And I would say, especially when you have an artist like Waring in the mix, who herself was conservative. She was, her work was conservative. She in her life was conservative. That ethos carries forward
Yeah.
well into the 20th century. And I think comes up against real fears of wild Black women.
Mhm. Mhm, mhm,
And so you want them to be accomplished, but not too accomplished,
mhm.
right?
Yeah, I as you described Flossie, that picture popped into my
Mm.
mind from Henry Louis Gates' foreword to the Facing History
Mhm.
catalog,
Yes.
and and she's dressed, she's like a Gibson girl,
I kind of
with
have it.
you
I
do.
think I have it right here.
This is African American Art History Nerd Fest here.
I just unpacked my books 2 days ago,
Yeah.
so yeah.
So
So anyway, keep talking, keep talking.
yeah, no, I mean that that's an
Mhm.
image that really is quite indelible because it presents such
Oh,
such a structured and
yeah. I don't know if you can see it. Her
yeah,
name is
lift it up a little
Gussie.
higher. Yeah, there she is.
This is it.
There she is.
This is Gussie. And Gussie is an admirer of fine art, a performer on the violin and the piano, a sweet singer, and a writer mostly given to essays, a lover of good books, and a homemaking girl.
Yeah.
That's Gussie.
Yeah, and
Yeah. Yeah.
that that goal, right,
Mm.
setting that as a kind of goal, as a standard for Black women, at a moment when it was very
Right.
difficult for most Black women to to achieve, let alone aspire
Right.
to
Right.
that kind of middle
Right.
class situation.
Yeah.
um
Well,
Ellen
there's a
Miles.
disconnect. There's a
Yeah,
disconnect, right? Because at the same time, you have these women who are basically movers and shakers as much or more than many of the men who are also
yeah,
depicted.
yeah.
And so you're the first judge, the first graduate of Harvard, this and that. And so it is
Mhm,
jarring.
mhm. Well, and with the Harmon Foundation, those early exhibitions that they
Yeah.
did, artists like May Howard Jackson,
Hmm.
served as jurors for it, but
Yeah.
never experienced the support,
Right.
for their own art,
Right.
even though they put a tremendous amount of labor.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
must have been very frustrating. Um, I want to start going through some of the questions that we have from the audience,
Okay.
including from my former colleague Ellen Miles, who asks, when the portraits were displayed, were the
Mhm.
biographies of the sitters included?
This is a wonderful question. And I have to be honest with you, I don't know. I have not figured that out yet, and I've not seen any installation shots. They
Yeah.
were, and reviews of the shows list list all of the people. They're, they do say who the people are, which tells me that at least, because I can't imagine
Hmm.
that these reviewers all went and looked up, who these people were. That if nothing else, people's titles were there,
Hmm.
and they, and the works that have come down to us haven't included the whole label.
Yeah. Now, that's
But I
one
just
thing with
haven't
those.
done enough work yet. This is so new.
Yeah,
Yeah.
with those
Yeah.
Harmon Foundation publications, often they're just lists of names and,
That's it. Yeah.
because it was difficult to reproduce
Right.
images, and
Right.
so it's hard to know
Yeah.
the record.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Uh,
in the Harmon, in the brochure for this show,
mhm,
because they did publish one and I did see it, they don't give descriptions of the people.
mm,
There are reproductions of some of the images,
mhm.
but they don't
Hmm,
give bios of the sitters.
that's so interesting, to have an
Yeah.
exhibition like that, and and well, now, I mean, now we have to try and fill in the blanks. So,
Yeah.
John Ott has a question about the press, which I'll
Hmm.
swing into now, about the leftist
Hmm.
press. How did the leftist press, Daily Worker, New Masses, etc., respond to the exhibition? Was it different than the response from the mainstream art press?
Hmm.
And how was the white press versus the Black press in reactions and understanding of the exhibition?
That's a really good question. And hi, John. Um, I have not seen the leftist press yet. And so in the mainstream press, so we're talking Washington Post, New York Times, Seattle, LA Times, etc. People, yeah, the story is largely the same. And it's a very sort of matter of fact, if they're commenting on the main show in DC from 1944, they're really talking about the fact that the Carver portrait was given to the Smithsonian, and that it's the first image of a Black person to enter the collection. And they're talking about the fanfare around the bestowal of the gift. And oh, by the way, there are 22 other portraits, and these are some of the people depicted. Um, the the Christian Science Monitor was the one thing that I read, and they were talking about, oh, people are, getting out of adversity despite their handicaps, and they don't look like being Black is a problem. The Black press, from what I've seen the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, the Washington African American, a few others, they don't say a lot, which is not surprising. I don't think it's an indication of any attention given to the show. It's more the lack of attention given to the visual arts generally, because those papers tended not to. But every so often, there's something that creeps in where they will interview someone who saw the show. And so there was one paper that interviewed some Black teenagers, some Black teenage boys who saw the show. And they would say things like, well, seeing this just makes me feel better. This is the thing we know, right? Bolstering Black self-esteem.
Yeah.
But no one that I've seen puts together these pictures with the project of racial equality, which is really Reyneau's project, and it probably not completely unproblematic. And so no one makes that leap. And I think, and that's I guess the needle in the haystack I'm looking for, because in a way, we can say that the portrait is itself and more than itself. But there's a weird, and I didn't really get a chance to get here, and something I think that really needs to be developed. We look at these portraits differently. And what I mean by that is that, we look at these portraits and we're like, oh, they're credits to their race. Why can't the rest of you be like them? As opposed to, gee, we're looking at these portraits and W.E.B. Du Bois is amazing. We've been wrong. So people don't say we've been wrong. People say we're surprised. So, yeah, because the expectations for Black people are so damn low. And so these things register as blips in a way, and blips that are popular.
Yeah, so there have been a couple of questions that have come through about this collection of works, including, so they're in our collection at the National Portrait Gallery. Yes. We display them in different at different moments. So right now, I just did a little search, and there are 10 of the Betsy Graves Reyneau portraits that are currently on view in the galleries, but they're not displayed all together. Rather, we place them in galleries where they're adjacent to other pieces that correspond very directly to them. So, for example, right now there's in our 20th century galleries, is where you'll find these, but like the Joe Louis portrait is in our Champions exhibition. The portrait of William Ayres Campbell is on the second floor in our Struggle for Justice exhibition. And so we integrate these portraits into the rest of the collection now. A few years ago, there's a question about these portraits having their own exhibit from Suni Cardenas Gomez, who asked about that. Our colleague Talisa Fleming from National Museum of African American History and Culture did a catalog exhibition of this work called Breaking Racial Barriers.
1997.
So a few years back.
And
which brought them all together, and thought about them as a whole. But at this moment we have 10 of these works which are on view, and so you have to kind of search for them. Thinking about them being displayed all together really presents something very different. So
it's a story, it would be an amazing story of patronage, right? And collaboration, and in a way, it would also, in 2020, it would shift a conversation that Talisa was sort of staging in 1997. So she brought them together and wondering what's that about? There is this sort of moment in the 1940s that's unique and different. I think in 2020, what what would be really interesting to me, and I sort of signaled this a little bit when I thought I was going to do something on wearing, and then just got pulled off in a different direction. It would be about, sort of the relationship between these organizers and what they did, issues of voice. I mean, the things that we think about right now,
Mhm.
right? Who's speaking for whom? What's the Harmon Foundation's role in actually shaping? Where's philanthropy coming into play, which I indicated in the abstract? But if Brady is calling the shots, it says something about philanthropy and the direction that visual representation is taking, right?
Mhm.
And so, and even there was one comment in one of the sources I read where they said, well, a number of artists wouldn't do it because the style that Reyneau and Brady wanted was too conservative.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
yeah.
So here's a question from Kinshasa Holman Conwell,
Kinshasa, hi.
who says, "Hello, dear Dr. Nelson. Excellent lecture. Can you say more about the
Mhm,
depiction of these subjects given the context of Black life in the years represented? For instance, you note that
mhm,
Brown v. Board of Education had
mhm.
not become law and
Right,
was fraught even when it did at the
right,
time of many of these works, a time when African Americans and their achievements were constantly questioned and
right,
demeaned, and their
right,
lives and bodies might be the subject of extraordinary violence that often
right.
went unanswered. Are these portraits more extraordinary given the foregoing?"
That's such a great question. And I think that the portraits are aspirational. And I mean, particularly, I mean, the everyone's favorite, frankly, is the Carver portrait, right? But I think they're aspirational. So they're not depicting the world as it is. I think they're depicting the world as we want it to be. But the 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education is key here, because when that decision was the end of this show, it was no coincidence that that show ended in 1954, because when that happened, the Harmon Foundation said, oh, we're good, we're all equal, bye. And so everything got crated up and brought back to the foundation. And so, but there is a whole world of things that are occluded, that are elided, that are suppressed in these kinds of representations. And I think that one question we could ask about that is whether or not part of that is a function of the artist. Did she just not know? Or did she just not know who to talk to?
Mhm.
And that's a possibility. And what I think is even, okay, I was about to say funny, but it's weird. A number of journalists thought that Reyneau was Black. And so in a bunch of articles, it was like, oh, two African American artists, two
Mhm.
Black artists, two Black women. Um, and but I think that one can ask where, for lack of a better term, cultural competence comes into play. Did she know what she was seeing? Did she
Mhm.
know? Did she know what to ask? Did she know, you know, about the difficulties of Black life? And did she care? Which I
Mhm.
think, and I don't mean that in a dismissive way, but she had her agenda, right? And the lifting that work was supposed to do was in the service of her idea of fostering some notion of racial equality, however problematic or however paternal it
Mhm.
might have been.
Well, she seems to have had a lot of sensitivity about some of those sitters. Looking at the
Yeah,
Richmond Barthet, I
that's
mean, she
amazing.
that is
That's
such a
amazing.
clear
He's kind of like,
picture.
he's like
He's
hugging Lincoln.
practically, yeah, I actually thought he was embracing Jesus. It's Lincoln.
Same thing.
Same difference, right? There you go. So I want to give an opportunity here to our other lecturers who have joined us. If any of you have a question before we begin to wrap up, as we're hitting the 6 o'clock hour.
I just had a quick question, and I know that some of these were
Mhm,
asked in the chat too, about the venues where the show was
mhm.
shown, and if, yeah, and if you could talk a little bit about the geography, and maybe if
Mhm.
sort of north, south, east, west
Yeah.
venues might play into your larger
Mhm.
argument about the
Mm.
message about equality.
This is such a great question. And I mean, the short answer is it went everywhere. And so it went northeast, the south, the west, the southwest. It was in Seattle, LA, Milwaukee, Brooklyn Museum had it. It was, in Atlanta. I mean, it went everywhere. And some, were just, there were also libraries. And so you could order a set of prints and have it in your
Stephen,
library.
I
Yeah.
want to jump in there and ask a question,
Yeah.
which was in the Q&A also.
Mhm.
Were any of these venues segregated? Were they for white audiences only, or were there?
I don't know off the top of my head. I think we'd have to do some
Yeah.
digging. I wouldn't be surprised. Those in the north likely not, and the Smithsonian wasn't. And those in the west, I'm not sure, because some of these also went to Black serving institutions. So it might be the Black branch of the public library. It might be. But what's interesting, what I did the one thing I did find in the time I had up to now was a controversy in Boston over the inclusion of the portrait of Paul Robeson as Othello. And so, the director of the mayor of Boston, John Hines, the mayor of Boston, demanded that the picture be taken out because of Robeson's communist sympathies. And so there was a back and forth, a big back and forth. It came out of the Boston show. In other cities, people had nothing to say about it. And so there is these sort of weird limit cases towards what can you represent in something that seems so benign, frankly. And what are these kicking up for people? And so, and this is Boston, I think, was in 48. And so it's just, on the verge of people getting really, the Red Scare, and people getting really crazy, and people, but that there was that moment where, I think that there are these fissures, and I think one would have to go locally and track that show. I mean, it's kind of a great digital humanities project. Track the show, map the show, and see what was said about that show wherever it went. And I think we would have these regional differences based on race, differences perhaps based on gender too.
Yeah. Such a we think about shows traveling now, and they go 2 or 3 places, and these were not long stops either, right? They must have been like a week, 2
weeks, maybe a month. Yeah, they were
so
pretty
people
short.
really came out, and just having that opportunity, you didn't want to miss it.
Yeah,
you would go in. Here's a question from Randall Griffey. Randy says, completely engrossed by this presentation. Thank you. Issue/question. The widespread discourse of racial uplift throughout the early 20th century was underpinned by eugenics, which prior to the association with the Holocaust was quite mainstream and cut across lines of race and ethnicity. W.E.B. Du Bois, his talented 10th, right, was seemingly inflected by the pseudoscience of eugenics, among many other manifestations. I wonder if you, Dr. Nelson, could comment on this complicated history, particularly as it intersected with African-American art and history in this period, which is still often overlooked and even avoided.
That is,
Randy's like, you can't avoid this now.
Yeah, right. So it's such a great question, and it's one of the $64,000 questions, because people like Du Bois, people like Booker T. Washington, they believed in natural selection. They believed that there was this sort of ladder of humanity, where people were different. So, for example, Washington's a great example. In 1906, he penned an article that ran in the New York Times that was similar to the book, and the progress of Black people from slavery to 1906. And he's talking about these same figures that were in these books, and Gussie, people like that. But he makes this extraordinary statement, and he says, well, I'm going to paraphrase badly, but you'll get where I'm going with this. Not everyone has sort of achieved all of this stuff. We can see the residents of Africatown in Mobile as the people who are kind of at the bottom of this ladder. And what he meant particularly Cujo Lewis, who had come to Mobile in 1860 as a teenager and lived to 1935. And he was the subject of Zora Neale Hurston's 31 Novel Barrack and all of the stuff. But he saw that group of people, those sort of Yoruba and West African descended people who had made their lives in Mobile, as these people who, these people who time forgot. Mm. And so that, those things that we see, and you can see it, in FSA photography, we see it in Black circles too. And the Talented Tenth is all about that, because they were not only the people who had evolved, but the people who would lead us to salvation. And so I think there's a lot to be said for that. And the closest someone like a Gates got to it, in that 1990 essay, was to talk about a kind of breaking of the present with the past. And so unlike what we see, say, in the 30s with this continuity, this sort of national continuity, in the 1900s, we see this sort of conscious, willful breaking of a new Negro with old Negroes, sort of positions and lifeways and the like. And so it's a huge issue. It's a huge issue.
I was really, impressed by how much Jeffrey Stewart teases that out in relation to Elaine Locke, and in his amazing biography of Elaine Locke. Where Locke we see as this great champion of of African American folk culture, of the people, of the new Negro, drawing on that usable past that you mentioned, right? The usable past, and yet completely, totally not interested himself in being a part of that community, or he loved classical music. And preferred to spend his time in Germany, and raise as much money as he possibly could to stay out of and away from the folk.
Well, it's but it's also it's in a way eugenics and modernism sort of buck up against one another and kind of intermingle, especially when you think of a figure like Elaine Locke. And so he's sort of suggesting that African American cultural workers, artists, writers should look at their African pasts. And he gets licensed for that by people like Picasso and Brancusi, and he's very much engaged in that discourse, and then trying to adapt it to a kind of formation of a modern and modernist African American art. And he's doing it in 1925.
So we've gone a little longer than we usually go. I want to end with a question from Gwendolyn Everett.
Hi, Gwendolyn.
Yeah, so Gwen writes, "Hi, Stephen. Are you working on a publication about these portraits in this exhibition? And if so, when can we expect to have it on our shelves?"
Well, that's an easy answer. I'm writing an essay on this exhibition based on the blathering I just did for all you all for my friend Gwendolyn Du Bois-Shaw in the National Portrait Gallery. And so this is, it's funny because I was kind of embarrassed because all of these brilliant people who have spoken before me were like, this is part of a massive project I'm doing that's going to be amazing and change the field and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, this is something I've been thinking about. And I think, and I don't know what to do with it. And it's really, and for me personally, I realized that over the past couple of years, I've been writing more and more about portraits and portraiture and national identity and these things. And it's almost an accident. And I blame the Obama portraits for this. and I've just been thinking a lot about it. And so for me personally, and professionally, this fits into that trajectory. So I don't think that we'll see a book from me on this, but I think we will see an article that will go to my good friend Gwendolyn Du Bois-Shaw. And when Gwendolyn can tell you when.
Yeah.
When.
So all of the presenters in the Richardson lecture series will be completing the work on their essays and contributing them to a new journal that we hope to launch within the next year called Portal Proceedings. So I hope everybody looks out for that. I want to thank you so much, Stephen, for
Thank
the
you.
presentation
Thanks,
tonight and the
everyone.
conversation and all the goodwill. I want to thank everyone who presented in the Richardson lecture series for 2020. I want to give a super big thanks to my colleague Jackie Petito, who has been behind the scenes in all of this and has just been incredible. It has been such a joy to work with Jackie. This is the last in this series. It's also the last Portal program that I will be hosting. I will be stepping down from my position as the director of Portal at the end of this year. And my colleague Kate Clark-LeMay will be taking over for me in the coming year. So we can all look forward to a bunch of great programs organized by Kate and Jackie. And so for now, I want to sign off and thank you again for coming and assure you that all of the questions that we weren't able to get to, and Stephen, there were a lot of questions tonight, all of those are going to be downloaded and shared with Stephen, and he can reply to you because we also have your email addresses, so he can get back to you if there's a question that requires that. So thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Gwendolyn. Thank you, Jackie. Good night, everybody.